Hello again and welcome to Lifestyle Gardening. I'm Kim Todd and we've got another excellent program for you today. On today's program, we'll be focusing on some great houseplant selections, as well as taking a look at interesting tree bark and berries for winter interest around your home. Later on in the show, we'll take a stroll around Spring Creek Prairie and show you how to bring the prairie to your own front yard. But to start the program off, we're going to hear from Jeff Culbertson about ways you can prevent those wascally wabbits from doing permanent damage to your shrubs and ornamentals over the winter.
We've been out walking through campus, looking at our landscape, seeing what damage we may have had over the winter. One thing we're starting to see on a lot of our shrubs is rabbit damage. This particular grouping here is oak leaf hydrangea. For us, normally we don't see a lot of damage in this particular area, but because of the depth of the snow cover, the rabbits were really able to get into these plants. And with rabbits, you know, the telltale damage is a very clean cut, 45-degree angle cut on the plants. It's going to be on the lower branches. This year, because of the snow depth, we may see it a little higher up. And so it may be a bit of a surprise for most of us as we walk through the landscape. Here are another location looking at members of the family of Rosaceae. This is a crabapple. So obviously roses and crabs, and there's many other members of that family that are in particular favorite food sources of rabbits, especially over the winter that they're looking for browse. We can see here with this crabapple that they've just come up here and just nibbled every little branch, every small branch off this larger branch. So we have several examples of this in these weeping crab apples that we have here. Now we're looking at a hazelnut. This is one that a lot of folks may have, the Harry Lauder's walking stick, very ornamental shrub. As you can see, lots of curled branches, which people really enjoy, and it's nice in leaf. In this particular spot, the rabbits have really come through and done a lot of damage here, taking a lot of the ends of the branches off. And this one will provide some challenges when doing some cleanup on this one. Well, the snow has melted, so we're back here in the Arboretum looking at these oak leaf hydrangeas to kind of reevaluate what we had after looking at them in the snow and the damage we had from the rabbits. As you can see, we've installed a fence around the plants here to continue to protect them. That's one thing for a lot of us. We think, well, winter's past, spring is up, the critters are out eating on different things, maybe the new grass in your lawn, and they might be doing that. But you can have tremendous damage early in the spring, early summer. So if you have some plants that seem to be a favorite of the local animals, you want to go ahead and get those fenced anyway. Then the next thing you want to do is some corrective pruning. And again, you want to protect these plants so they don't continue to be chewed on if you're going to be doing some pruning. And when we do the pruning, initially, especially with plants that are heavily damaged, we want to make sure we don't get too carried away. I usually look for a bud and then prune just slightly above the bud. If you feel like you need to take the plant farther down, do it carefully. At this time of year, especially after a hard winter like we've had, I'd hesitate to totally renovate the plant. Maybe just take out select canes and clean up some of the animal damage. Remember, it's still early in the spring, so we don't have to get everything pruned at once. Evaluate your plants, be conservative in your pruning. Make sure when you're out with your pruners and your saw that you have your gloves on and your safety glasses, that you protect yourself, because these are sharp things.
We taped that feature a few winters ago, but the lesson is still valid. Rabbits and other critters are looking for any food they can find when it's cold and snowy outside. The best way to keep them from using your shrubs and trees as a buffet is to get them fenced out as much as you can. As we've seen from the video, some careful pruning of any damaged limbs or stems in the spring will help your plants recover nicely. Houseplants can either be a great way to continue your favorite pastime during the colder months, or a wonderful way to have some accent plants in and around your home, or both. We went to the greenhouse recently to show you a few excellent plants you can try in your home. It's hard hard to imagine any place more restorative in the cold, dark, dreary months of the winter than a greenhouse. Not only does it restore your own soul and spirit, you can breathe deeply, and you can also get a great idea of the kinds of house plants that you could enjoy in your own home, whether they're for foliage or flowers, or even in some instances, some fruit. A lot of people really love cactus and succulents, and they can actually be one of the easier things to grow in a greenhouse environment or in a window. These are on a west-facing side of the greenhouse, so they actually need a little bit more water than you might expect for a cactus. And some of them are pretty ancient, 25 or 30 years old. Now, to a lot of people, cacti have those nasty, sharp spines. Some of them look pettable, but they're not. You pet those and you're going to end up regretting the evils of your ways. Others have beautiful, beautiful flowers like the crowns of thorns. One of the things to remember about cacti and succulents is the best way to kill them is to overwater them. So for people who have a tendency to forget about their houseplants, cacti and succulents might really be a really good choice. If plants that draw blood are not exactly up your alley, you might want to think about some of the flowering plants. Orchids are a wonderful choice, and they actually are a lot easier to grow than people might think. They come in a huge array of colors, forms of flower, and actually even shapes of plants themselves. They're epiphytes, which means that they really like to grow in the jungle, sort of attached to tree trunks. So if you take a look at the kind of media that you grow orchids in, it's essentially almost a bark chunk kind of a thing. They will bloom for 10, 12, 16 weeks under the right conditions. And again, the flower color and quality is all over the place, from purest white, tiny little flowers, great big ones. One of the easiest orchids to start with is the moth orchids, and these are ones that actually are oftentimes available not only in garden centers, but sometimes even in the grocery store, especially this time of year. Typically, they also like to be root bound, so you don't have to worry about repotting these a lot. Of course, a lot of people grow houseplants for their foliage. And one of the things about houseplants with nice foliage is they are not only good to look at, but plants like this spider plant can actually do a great job of cleaning the air in your home. You might notice that this is an unusual spider plant in that it's a reverse variegation. Usually the center of the blade is white, in this case it's the margins, and these actually have more substance than some of the traditional spider plants. Ivies are a good choice for a foliage plant. You do have to watch out for spider mites with ivies, however. And some of the Swedish ivies have variegated foliage. Things like Purple Heart give a beautiful purple color as well as a little bit of flower. We also have a plant that's a little harder to grow, but one that's really fun, and this is Sensitive Plant. And people who have experienced this as children know that all you do is pet that leaf and the leaf folds up and indicates that it's really unhappy with that kind of attention. Finally, for any gardener who just can't stand the thought of not getting their hands in the soil this time of year, propagating houseplants is one way for you to do that. You can take cuttings or slips off plants that you really love, stick them in that soil, treat them properly. Pretty soon you have more of a good thing. More importantly, you start out in any greenhouse in the state of Nebraska and get that restorative feeling. Just getting out of the cold into a warm greenhouse to browse for houseplants can be a fun escape from being cooped up all winter. And given the right treatment and care, your houseplants can give you a lot of enjoyment all year long. Nebraska is a prairie state from the Missouri River to the sandhills up north to Chimney Rock, and our native grasses and wildflowers define where we are from. Taking those elements we see in our state and trying to replicate some of that plant life in our own gardens is an excellent way to not only grow plants that have a great chance at thriving, but it's also a way to celebrate where we are from. We recently visited Spring Creek Prairie near Denton to show you how you can bring the prairie to your own home landscape. To understand the prairie, you have to be in the prairie. There's really no experience like it, to be surrounded by grasses that are in constant motion, swaying with even the slightest breeze, creating beautiful movement and sort of a rippling sea-like effect, covered with insects, making all sorts of noises, giving you just a fabulous sense of the amount of life that is within this particular environment. People who really want to use the prairie plants in their own landscape have to understand the essence of the place. Otherwise, what they'll end up doing is buying one or two of those grasses, placing them in a location where they really don't have that, even the capability of doing that movement or attracting those insects. Then they wonder why they're really disappointed in the outcome. What they're really missing is the fact that prairies are a sea of grasses with all the other plants blended in with them and not standing all by themselves as individual specimens. We've seen the beautiful expanse of the prairie grasses out at Spring Creek Prairie as they go into their fall color. From a distance, this house might look as though it is sitting right in the prairie itself. That's not true. What we really have is we have an owner who wanted to have the feeling of living in the prairie, and yet up close and personal, they wanted a far more managed landscape. One of the great things that happens here is we have a large expanse of prairie, easy to manage, naturalized, fits in with Nebraska style. We have something far more manicured up close, and yet we've used ornamental grasses to be able to give you a character or a piece of that prairie or something similar as we approach the house. To zone a landscape within a prairie setting, a couple of things are really important to consider. First of all, as you move closer to the home, typically what you have is plant material that may or may not be native, may not be prairie plants, but certainly can provide opportunity for additional color, a lot more variety, and probably a higher intensity level of management. In this particular instance, what the homeowners have chosen to do is include a very small area of very intensely managed, extremely beautiful turf, which gives very high contrast both to the woody plant material that is in the very intense close-up zone, as well as with the prairie grass that is entirely surrounding the perimeter. They've also chosen to do some things like use the ornamental grasses as a way of bringing in texture, bringing in similarity, and again providing contrast. So you just don't have shaggy prairie on the perimeter of the property and then all of this really highly intensely managed perennials and shrubs and trees and those sorts of things up close to the house. You have vestiges of both. What we have behind us is Japanese bloodgrass, which is spreading well. It's not out of bounds. It's picking up the color of the door. It's not going to get large. And of course, in the prairie setting, things like little blue stem are going to turn that beautiful burgundy in the fall as well. They've used such things as the hardy pampas grass in the background, not as a permanent plant material, but as something to give them a lot of height against that vertical wall until the woody plant material, the shrubs and trees, get a little bit more size on them. And then they also have a beautiful stand of switchgrass. This happens to be one of the selections of switchgrass, but switchgrass is a prairie native. And so again, there is that continuity of design and that transition between the managed landscape and the prairie landscape. To create a good zone landscape in this prairie situation, one of the things you really have to pay attention to is the bed lines. And in this particular instance, you'll notice the fountain grass is really overshadowing the managed turf. That actually has become an issue with this use of this ornamental grass. And so what's really going to happen here is the owner has decided they want to get rid of this fountain grass, even though it does create a really beautiful texture and a lot of interest, and it's been used appropriately in a big, large sweep, just like you would see in the prairies. What they're going to end up doing here is reestablishing the bed line, going back in probably with woody plant material as well as potentially a smaller ornamental grass in this particular situation. One of the ways that ornamental grasses really can be used effectively, again as a transition either from a prairie or into a more intensely managed landscape, is when they are used in combination with woody plant material. And that's a good lesson for us to consider when we plant plants in our own home gardens. Sometimes they look great and thrive. Sometimes the plan is better than the execution, and it might be time to try something different. Keeping an open mind and starting over might be the only way to shape up your home landscape. If you've been hit hard with snow this winter, you know the value of a good snowblower. Especially in Nebraska, it's a good idea to keep your favorite snow-moving machine in good working order. For this week's landscape lesson, we're going to hear from UNL mechanic Don Burish about maintaining your snowblower.
So we're going to go through a few steps as far as the preparation of our snowblower for the season. The number one thing we're going to start out with is make sure that it runs. So we will check so we have gas, pull it over, see if it starts. If it starts, then we'll go through our next step, which is we'll check our paddle and our scraper to make sure they're in good operating condition so they clean the snow from the concrete. We will then check our belt to make sure that it is not cracked or worn, so that the first time we go out we don't get 10 feet and the belt breaks and the machine doesn't work. And that'll be the few minor things that we'll go over today, as far as there's not a lot of steps, but it's stuff that we would definitely want to have ready for the season. One of the steps we want to also make sure we check is our wheels and our axles, so that they're not bent or broke from people dropping them on the concrete. Another step we're going to work on is as far as checking our primer and our choke system so it does start easily and properly for us. And we'll just go over the basics as far as if it doesn't start immediately, the steps that we need to start back over and go again. We will check our chute for our discharge to make sure that it is operating properly, so it turns right and left and up and down, so we can get the snow out of our way when we're ready to clear snow. As an overview, the time to check this stuff is now, before we get snow. What we want to do is make sure that everything is up and running, because we don't want to walk out there next morning with 6 inches of snow on the ground and no snowblower starting. So just make sure we go over our basics as far as if we have any problems, refer to your owner's manual, because there's a lot of good information. If that doesn't get it, just take it to your local servicing dealer and they will take care of you. But the main thing is we want to check it now, because once it becomes snow, the dealers will be too busy to look at your stuff. So you want to just do the simple stuff at this time.
The maintenance of your snowblower is best done in the fall before any of that snow hits. That way you can be reasonably sure that it's going to start and all the attachments are in good working order. No one wants to have a dead machine and have to resort to going back to scooping that 12 inches of blizzard. We always like to answer a few questions on our program. So remember, if you'd like to submit a question to our show, that email address is byf@unl.edu. We have a question from a viewer in Fort Calhoun, and this is about a cornelian cherry dogwood, which is actually a wonderful small shrub-like tree or tree-like shrub, depending on how you want to think about it, with beautiful bark, very, very early spring yellow flowers before the foliage emerges, and then nice glossy foliage later and fruit for the birds and the squirrels. This particular one has been haircut, essentially, years and years ago, so has all these sort of knobby-looking wads of twigs right at the top of the tree, and then when he moved in, had grown out about 12 to 15 to maybe even 3 feet. So the question is there any way to get that tree or that cornelian cherry to grow out of that kind of odd-looking haircut form from the pruning? The answer is yes, but it'll take a little bit of time to do that. And what you're going to want to do is stagger the cuts, take no more than 1/3 of the wood, if even that much, at any given time, and go down below where that odd clump of twigs is, make a cut with a branch facing outward, and do that actually after that tree blooms in the spring. Otherwise, you're going to lose the benefit of those flowers. So it may take 3 or 4 years to get that plant to grow out of that funny pruning. Our second question is from Hastings, and this is a viewer who has red twig dogwood, a great big stand of the red twig dogwood. And unfortunately, they're seeing a lot of kind of whitish twigs and black twigs, and some of the bases of those shrubs are really not doing very well. That's probably canker, and it's pretty common for red twig dogwood to get canker, as well as a lot of our other landscape plants. The main thing that you'll want to do on that is go ahead and prune those twigs completely out and get rid of them, and make sure that you watch for kind of those dark sunken areas on the ends of the twigs to remain, because that's probably the canker starting, and you can actually prune without having to remove all of those twigs if you catch it early enough. We have a rabbit damage question, and this is from Auburn. This is a person who has euonymus, or dwarfed wing euonymus, which is the burning bush, and terrible, terrible rabbit damage all over the base. They have apparently chewed all the way around the bark at the snow line, or certainly at some line where the leaves were. And their question is there any chance of this shrub coming out of that terrible rabbit damage? A couple of things to keep in mind. First off, wait until spring in this particular instance to see what actually leaves out again. And secondly, if the plant is not too old, and it looks like this one is fairly young, chances are with this particular species you could go ahead and take that, essentially we say to the ground, we don't really mean that, we mean take it down to about 12 to 16 inches and see what will come out from the base of that again. But this is also one of the plants that is absolutely beloved by rabbits, so you want to make sure next year that you do that caging or fencing that Jeff spoke about. We have a question from Seward about boxwood, and in a dry, open winter and in a location where that particular broadleaf evergreen can be exposed to this drying wind and the temperature extremes, what you see is tips on the ends, depending on the variety, that are essentially bleached. And what has happened is that end of the twig and those leaves have completely dried out or desiccated. So their question is, when should they prune that off, and will the plant recover? We would not recommend doing any pruning on those particular shrubs right now, even though it's a little bit unsightly. Part of the reason for that is where you make that pruning cut, you now have opened up additional tissue of that plant to more of that drying wind or more of those temperature extremes. You might get even more dieback than you already have. So we recommend waiting until spring, when the temperature and the weather has kind of calmed down and lightened up a little bit, we hope, and then take a look at where the new foliage emerges, and then you can take off those dead tips. We have a question from Gearing about bullet galls on oak. And this is a question that we get a lot on the regular show, more than we used to, in fact, and even in the eastern part of the state. What in the world are they supposed to do about these bullet galls? And this is a case from Gearing where it's pretty extreme infestation. The galls are caused by a little wasp, and once the galls actually start to form, there really is nothing you can do. The galls may continue to form even if the original insect has died. So, and in this particular instance, they're so numerous that they have actually covered the twigs. So the issue here is that they may stunt the growth of those twigs themselves and really cause some damage to younger plants. You can pick them off, and again, that's best done when you have a younger tree and a far smaller infestation of bullet galls. Of course, there's not much green and growing outside right now, but that doesn't mean there aren't unusual things for you to see on these dreary winter days. Interesting tree bark or shrub berries can turn your gray and dull backyard into a thing of beauty and full of interest whenever the sun isn't shining. Let's take a look at some great examples of bark and berries. When gardeners choose plants for the landscape, oftentimes the first thing that they consider is the color of the flowers. And of course, those don't really last very long. Form is very, very important, but remember also that during the winter months, which can extend oftentimes from October all the way into March or April, what we really have to look in the landscape is berries and bark. So let's talk a little bit about some of the plants that will give us that beauty of either berries or bark during the winter months. First off, some of the unusual plants with berries include winterberry, and the deciduous holly or winterberry, especially one called red sprite, has incredible, beautiful fruit. It doesn't tend to persist very long into the winter months, but it certainly does give a show up into December or so. We have Japanese beautyberry, which has incredible amethyst-colored fruits. That one, again, is not persistent, but during those late fall or early winter months, gives us a total touch of color in the landscape. A lot of our viburnums also have fruit that is persistent, and those can be chosen either for a black fruit or a reddish fruit. American cranberry bush, for example, will hold its fruit all through the winter months and becomes a last choice bird food come spring because it kind of has to ferment a little bit. Then you get the advantage of watching drunken birds travel all over the yard. The aronias are plants that we grow not only for the fall color, but for the fruit as well. Black chokeberry, obviously the fruit is black, hangs in deep dark clusters. Red chokeberry has brilliant, brilliant red fruit, and again will persist into the winter months. In addition to the fruits of shrubs, we have crab apples, of course, many of them with persistent fruit. Most of that stays kind of a reddish color and then either hangs on until the flowers push those fruits off in the spring months or until the birds take them. If we think about bark in the landscape, people tend to think first of trees like river birch and white birch. River birch, while it is a beautiful, beautiful plant, oftentimes is planted in the wrong location. If you think about the word river, that should tell you immediately that these are plants that like a bit of moisture. They don't like to sit on top of a berm in a south or southwest facing location. White birch or paper birch is not necessarily a plant that we recommend for a lot of locations in Nebraska, especially since it tends to be highly susceptible to bronzed birch borers. So let's think about a couple of other trees or small trees that have great bark interest. One of them is a plant called Seven Suns shrub, which is something you can't really say fast without one of those oddball sorts of things happening with your throat, but it has peeling bark and is oftentimes considered a hardy crepe myrtle, even though it isn't even remotely related to crepe myrtle. We also have cornelian cherry dogwood, which has kind of a plated bark. The same thing with Coosa dogwood, which is not for the western part of the state. We have a shrub that is oak leaf hydrangea, completely different from some of the other hydrangeas. And we also have the interesting bark either of lace bark pine, which even though it's an evergreen is grown for the lace bark as opposed to the evergreen needles. And finally, we have a couple of the Japanese tree lilacs, or the Pekin lilacs, which have this incredible cherry-like bark. So in addition to considering for the winter landscape some of the evergreens that we use, think about using some of the shrubs or trees with beautiful, beautiful berries or fruit that persist, or at least give you a little bit of interest during the fall of the year, as well as the bark of some of those great deciduous and evergreen trees. To create this kind of winter interest, it takes good planning to select plants that can survive our hot summers here in Nebraska and then persist through the coldest winter days. But the right plants can help make your home landscape much more beautiful year-round. That's going to do it for this week's edition of Lifestyle Gardening. Join us again next week when we show you more great gardening ideas for the upcoming growing season. Good afternoon, good gardening, thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next week.